For today's devotion, I want to speak on promises. Promises are something that we all understand. We're all familiar with what a promise is, right? We've made promises to other people, but we've also experienced promises being broken. And we know how bad that could hurt. But what I want to speak on is promises in terms of a limitless God. Promises that are made by God. Because when God makes a promise, he will never allow that promise to return to you empty. Now, there might be so many things that you're praying for right now. You might be wondering, God, where are you in the midst of this situation? Where are you with the fulfillment of this specific promise that you gave me years ago when I was a child? And the thing that I want to mention to you is that God always desires to fulfill a promise, but he will allow a promise to go delayed or suspended because of our lack of faith or our ways and our practices of limiting the promises of God. So we see that there's a limitless God, limitless promise that he has for us, but we ourselves are able to stand in opposition to that to create a limit on those promises. And I want to understand, and I want to help you understand, why is it that the limitless promises of God can become limited by us? In order to do that, we need to understand the genetic makeup of a promise. What does the promise consist of? Well, you can break it down into three components, right? There's, let's say, phase A is when the promise is made, right? God makes a promise with you. And phase C is when that promise is fulfilled. But there's this portion of time in the middle. There's a season in the middle, which is basically the waiting period. It's the waiting period from when the promise is made to when the promise is fulfilled. And this is one of the most vulnerable portions or moments of a promise, right? It's in this period where we're the most vulnerable because the enemy does not want to see a child of God live in the fulfillment of the promises that God has for them. So here in that waiting period, while we're wondering, God, where is the answer to our prayers, to my prayer? This is where the enemy will put division. This is where the enemy will put disruption. This is where the enemy will put denial. This is where our faith will be played with. In this area is where the enemy likes to play as if he's in a playground to get us to deviate from the plan of God so that the promise that God has for us becomes delayed, becomes suspended. And this is where we need to be very careful. We need to understand in this middle portion of a promise, in the waiting period, we need to have a proper identity of Christ and an identity of ourselves as children of God. Because if we don't, we understand that this is a vulnerable stage. And God will see or allow or cause a promise to be delayed because of our lack of faith and because of our submission to disruption and to delay that we cause for a promise to be fulfilled. So I want to share three questions with you that you need to ask yourselves today. If you're waiting for something, if you're waiting for a specific promise to be fulfilled that God has given you, and you're wondering why hasn't it been answered yet, ask yourself these three questions. And it'll give you an understanding as to, are you limiting a limitless promise of God, right? The first question that you need to ask yourself is, who are you listening to? Who are you listening to? In Genesis chapter 16, verse 1, we know the story of Sarai and Abram. And this is before their names were changed. And God had made an amazing promise to Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And it was an incredible promise because there we see that it was something that seemed so impossible, but God had decided to allow it to be done. And then in that time period, we see in Genesis chapter 16, verse 1, that Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. But she had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai told Abraham to go into Hagar so that the promise of God can be fulfilled. That's not something that God had told Abraham to do. He told Abraham that I will bless you and Sarah. But here we see that Sarah heard the promise of God and saw to it that the promise be fulfilled in her way. She didn't have faith to believe that God had a completely different plan. And we see that it was through that decision, that wisdom that Abraham accepted that was not of God ended up leading to the birth of Ishmael. And there's so many times in our lives when we listen to the voices of other people, the voices of people that we should not listen to. Our promises are fulfilled in the forms of Ishmael's rather than Isaac's. And we need to be so careful with who is it that we're listening to. Is it the voice of God, or is it the opinions of other people? Now, Abraham and Sarah ended up becoming heroes of faith, and we see that God fulfilled their promise. But it was after severe delay and heartache. The second question you need to ask yourself is, how is God preparing me in this season? This is a very serious question, because oftentimes we look at the struggle that we go through. We look at the promise the process that we go through from point A to point C. It's that waiting period becomes so difficult to the point where it feels as though that we'll never receive a promise from God. We're suffering here. We're going through so much trial and tribulation to the point where it just seems like, God, you're not seeing what I'm going through. It might feel that way. But in reality, it's in this period of time, it's in this season actually, that God is producing something within you that allows you to be prepared for the fulfillment of the promise. Because the reality is that sometimes the enemy would try to entice you with the promise itself before you're ready for that. That can be so dangerous. When a promise is fulfilled before the necessary and appointed time, it cannot be a blessing. It's more so a curse, because you're not ready to be able to live in the fulfillment of that promise. It's premature. So we always want to ask God for wisdom so that we're able to receive a promise in the proper time, and not try to oppose God's timeline and lead to something that is too premature, where it ends up hurting us more than helping us. So the second question you need to ask yourself is, how is God preparing me in this season? Is this trial, is the tribulation, is the hardship of the waiting period bettering me? Because if you can say yes, if it's producing value within you, then it's most likely that God is pruning you and preparing you for the fulfillment of that promise. The third and final question that you need to ask yourself to see if you're limiting a promise of God, you need to ask yourself, that is your desire for the promise itself, or is your desire for the person who's giving the promise? It's a very, very serious question we need to ask ourselves, because so many times we spend time in the presence of God. We spend time reading God's word. We spend time in prayer, not because we want to engage with God, but because we want to feel as though we've done our part to earn the fulfillment of a promise, right? It's usually when we hit rock bottom and we really want to get out of rock bottom that we spend time in the presence of God in incredible ways. And when we're out of that hump, then it's kind of like our relationship with God becomes very lackadaisical. Well, what we need to do is not put our focus on the promise. We need to set our eyes on Jesus, the person who originated the promise. And when our eyes are fixed on Jesus, then that's when we see promises become fulfilled. Because we're not worshiping God. We're not seeking God for the fulfillment of the promise. We're seeking God because of who he is. We're seeking Jesus and worshiping him because of what he's done on the cross. And that is such an incredible distinction that we need to make. The third question, once again, is, do you desire the promise, or you desire the person that fulfills the promise? Right? So ask yourself those three questions. If you feel as though that you're in a very difficult time in phase B of the waiting period, ask yourself, who are you listening to? Are they good influences? Are they people who can discern the voice of God? Secondly, is God preparing you in any way in this season? Is he developing you and molding you and pruning you in such a manner that you think will allow you to better steward the promise being fulfilled? And thirdly, are you focused on the promise, or are you focused on the person who's providing the promise? Are you focused on Jesus, right? And if you can answer all of those questions, it will begin to help you discern how should you move forward and how you can expect God to fulfill that promise in your life. May God bless you with these words.